5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Crouch, touch, set.
Welcome everybody to the second edition of This Week in Rugby. I am Alex Goff, RugbyMag.com's editor-in-chief and also editor of Rugby Magazine, and we've got Zachary Halpern behind the camera, and here we are at the beautiful campus of the Evergreen State College, which has hosted plenty of rugby tournaments and rugby games throughout its history. And we're talking this week about the weekend of April 20th and also the upcoming weekend, April 27th. We've got Elite Cup, we've got Varsity Cup, we've got D1 AA playoffs, and we're also talking a little bit about the pros. But first, coming up will be the Varsity Cup. And that's 8 teams from around the country, colleges that didn't really want to get caught up in what USA Rugby was doing with their playoffs. So we've had a little bit of a conflict on dates, and maybe a conflict on vision. Who's being recalcitrant? Who's being the one who's sort of taking their ball and going home? Well, it depends on who you ask. In the end, we've got USA Rugby's competition and we've got the Varsity Cup, and certainly the Varsity Cup has some pretty compelling games. Let's have a look first at the first bracket on the East Super Regional with Cal taking on Notre Dame and Navy playing Dartmouth.
The Navy Marine Corps Stadium played host to the Eastern Super Regional in the Varsity Cup. Navy taking on Dartmouth, Cal taking on Notre Dame. Plenty of history surrounding this stadium and this location. A lot of patriotism surrounding the events on the day. Well, we were hoping to see a couple of close games. Didn't really see them. Cal took care of Notre Dame pretty easily, 77-0. Notre Dame had a few big breaks, but the Cal cover defense was outstanding, and they moved the ball really, really well. Also, Lock Brendan Daly scored 2 tries, and matchday captain Danny Barrett, one of the older players on the field as they rested a couple of seniors, also scored 2. Cal just really moved the ball superbly, and Notre Dame really didn't have an answer. Navy against Dartmouth looked to be on paper a much closer game, and it really was in the sense that both teams had their share of possession, both teams had attacking opportunities, but Dartmouth struggled with keeping the ball in hand and made far too many errors, and Navy really punished them up front. Loosehead prop Darian Green had a huge game, and then of course Jack McAuliffe, he was brilliant as well at fly half. So Navy ended up winning 32-0 over Dartmouth. Dartmouth struggled, came close to scoring, but really in the end it was all Navy.
And then on the West Coast, UCLA hosted 3 other teams. The Bruins themselves played BYU, and it was 69-8 in the end for BYU. A little bit more competitive than the score would indicate, but the Cougars looking very, very strong. And then we had Central Washington play Air Force. Now, Central Washington was a late addition to the Varsity Cup because of Utah University's suspension of their program. That's all still up in the air. We don't know what's happening with that, but Central Washington certainly looked good, certainly very physical, and they can move the ball as well, and they beat Air Force 81-28. So we didn't really get the exciting, close games that we were hoping for, but we do have a semifinal matchup now with Central Washington going to play BYU and Cal taking on Navy. And really, does anyone doubt that it's going to be Cal against BYU in the final in Provo on May 4th? Doesn't look like it's going to be anything different than that. And that's going to be a terrific matchup. We're going to see possibly the best midfield combination in college rugby on BYU side with Hoseki Kofe and Paul Lasike. And then we see some terrific seniors from Cal. Seamus Kelly and Danny Barrett are going to want to go out with a championship.
So let's have a look at the D1 AA playoff bracket. In Knoxville, Tennessee this weekend, we're going to see Tennessee hosting Central Florida. Now, Central Florida has been kind of a surprise team, really crushing almost all their opponents this year. South Carolina takes on Clemson. Tigers having a strong year as well. Out in Pittsburgh, Middlebury takes on St. Bonaventure. That's kind of a pick'em game. Middlebury has been a long-time Division II power, moving up to Division I. Dartmouth, fresh off their loss to Navy, they'll have learned a great deal in that game, and actually they're a little bit disappointed with their performance. They'll be taking on Pitt. Pitt better watch out. Out in Tucson, Arizona takes on Long Beach. Long Beach had been in Division II for a very long time. In the last couple of years, really picked up their program. Arizona, 4th place in the PAC Rugby Conference. Arizona, 4th place in PAC Rugby, but a strong season nonetheless. Kind of a funny story with them, and they're hosting this bracket. We'll talk about that in a minute. Western Washington against Chico State. Chico State knows how to win these tough games, but Western Washington has absolutely crushed everyone in the Pacific Northwest. They're really building that program. Watch out for the Vikings. Lindenwood, another team that came out of almost nowhere. They won Division II last year. They look almost favored to win Division I this year. They take on Northern Illinois. And Bowling Green plays Rice. Bowling Green certainly favored in that game. Now back to the Arizona bracket, because there's kind of a funny story to go along with that.
When the University of Arizona defeated Arizona State and Oregon State in Pac Rugby Conference play, they had a reasonable expectation that they might be invited to the D1 AA playoffs. That did indeed happen, but then the Wildcats found out that they would have to travel to the Bay Area for their bracket, and there was a cost issue and a timing issue, and it wasn't going to work out. So in fact, head coach Dave Sitton called USA Rugby up to politely decline that invitation. Well, they accepted that declining, and then USA Rugby found out about an hour later that the hosting venue in San Francisco was going to fall through. They ended up calling Sitton back and asking not only would he like to come back in to the playoffs, but could he host the playoffs in Tucson. So within the space of less than 2 hours, the Wildcats went from being in the D1 AA playoffs to being out to being back in and hosting the entire bracket. Now on to club rugby.
The New York Athletic Club somehow pulled out a victory against Life University this past weekend, 25-22, despite missing several players and having some other players play a little bit hurt. Really tough week for AC as they ran into several injuries. Troy Hall, Phil Bailey, Chris Chapman, Alistair McFarland, Ryan Deal all ran into either injuries or availability issues for that game. Life University was also playing without some players, but really in the end the game turned out to be one about money so much as anything else, because the loser of that game, Life, will have to travel once again for the semifinals. It's going to cost them about $15,000 for that trip. That's really the cost of that loss. Now, looking back at the way these teams have played in the past, you can see that they are extremely physical. The sequences we've queued up for you show exactly how hard they hit in the forwards and also in the backs, and the physicality of these confrontations go through into the league games and certainly into the playoffs. Look for, in the midfield, Toby Lestrange is going to be a huge factor for NYAC. He's the fly half for them. He's the playmaker for them. He's working with Justin Hundley, and we're not sure if Mike Petrie is going to be available for them, coming back from his broken thumb, but Justin Hundley has been playing superbly for AC. And then they've got Phil Bailey, Troy Hall, Danny Grace, all in the backs, possibly. For Life University, it still comes down to the experienced players, Benny Mattiolona, Tui Osborne, Aaron McMaster kicking goals, Ash McGinty, also a great playmaker for them out in the backs. The guy who's really been playing extremely well for them, Benji Goff at flanker, no relation to the host of this show, and the University of Tennessee standout, has been excellent for Life. So has Blake Bradford, who scored a key try for Life University. And up closer to the front, some players you can really depend on. Chris Headley at lock or flanker, Seth Strauss, and Phil Teal, either prop or hooker. But whichever team gets the ascendancy on May 11th in the semifinal, you can be sure that they are going to knock the stuffing out of each other. And meanwhile, several of those players are going to be in Marietta this weekend for a USA national team camp. And so they'll go from being adversaries to teammates.
The Elite Cup finished up its Eastern bracket this past weekend, and the big game, as we talked about last week, was Life University against New York Athletic Club. And it ended up being kind of a physical, almost contentious match. Several yellow cards for Life University. That didn't help them at all. A really tough build-up week for New York Athletic Club because of all the injuries that they dealt with. That didn't help them. In the end, Athletic Club won 25-22. Now, this doesn't change who's in the semifinals. Both of those teams were going to play in the semis as it was. But the winner gets to host that semifinal in a few weeks. So really it was about money. New York Athletic Club won that game. That saves them about $15,000 in travel costs. And that's real money that's important to any club trying to compete in America. Both of these teams will be very physical, very tough, and we'll see probably a healthier team from both sides when they match up in a few weeks. Don't forget that on June 1st and 2nd in Philadelphia, 20 of the best college sevens teams will be competing at PPL Park for the USA Sevens Collegiate Rugby Championship. It's going to be on NBC, but it'll also be a great event for you to see in person. Go to USA7crc.com for tickets. And don't forget, you'll also be seeing a tournament from National Small College Rugby Organization. High school girls and women's college tournaments will all be going on there. USA7crc.com. International Rugby Board CEO Brett Gosper reiterated again this week something that he said before, that professional rugby is still a reality and could possibly come to fruition in the United States. However, people need to be cautious about this, because even if it does happen, it's not going to mean massive paydays for hundreds of rugby players around the country. What it could mean is a few more dollars in the pocket of players who right now are paying to play. Players who want to become professionals and full-time professionals are still going to need to go overseas. And right now, there are about 7 players from America who are playing large amounts of playing time for major pro clubs. Todd Clever, he's back in the United States, but he played for NTT Communications in Japan, and he was their big star, and we're lucky to have him back in the United States training and getting ready for the Eagles season. Lou Stanfill is in Italy, playing well, and Inaki Basari is with Tarbes in the French Pro D2, also playing regularly. Well, you have 4 big guys who are playing in major clubs at the moment. Samu Manoa at the Northampton Saints, just voted the Supporters Player of the Year, and Chris Wiles from Saracens. Both of those will be in the playoffs for the Premiership in England, and obviously American fans will be hoping that they'll do well. Then in France, Scott Lavala, who is a lock flanker for Stade Francais, and of course Taku Ngwenya, who's playing wing for Biarritz. They're both up into the semifinals of the Amlin Challenge Cup, and while their league season hasn't gone the way they wanted to, they've still got trophies to play for. What does that mean for American rugby fans? Well, it means that there's something for you to root for when you're watching the overseas games, but we also have to be cautious, because when the USA season comes around, there's mandatory stand-down time and there's mandatory rest time for all of these players. So we'll find ourselves hoping that they win, and at the same time hoping that perhaps they get a little bit of early rest time before the season is over so that they get to play for the Eagles throughout the summer. That'll do it for this week of This Week in Rugby, presented by RugbyMag.com. I want to thank Zachary for being behind the camera and editing this, and I'm Alex Goff, and we'll see you next week on This Week in Rugby.